Hello and welcome to the Work of Thy Hands podcast, where we interview Christian creatives conversing on the ways they have seen their creative projects as co-creative efforts with Christ, times they have drawn inspiration from the physical creation, and their thoughts surrounding the nature of work as a creative. I'm your host, Allison Ramirez, and today I am thrilled to be welcoming Madeline Shepley to the show. By day, Madeline is a planetarium director and physics astronomy professor. By night, she is both a writer, author, and also a fellow podcaster. She has two short stories out in anthologies. The Fool's Fox, or The Fool's Fix, is a near future sci fi vibe that takes place in the same world as her sci fi novel, Work in Progress. And The Spooky Action at a Closeness is a Christmas ghost story that takes place at an observatory. Her main work in progress, currently titled Shroud of Secrets, is a grounded sci-fi about secrets, grief, and learning to lay down your burdens. On her podcast, Shine Bright Like the Firmament, she interviews fellow Catholic STEM professionals about their scientific work and faith journeys. In all of this, Madeline loves being able to use both these mediums in order to create beauty that conveys the truth of the Lord as he has made beauty and truth inseparable. Welcome, Madeline.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. I'm really excited to get to talk about creativity, the Lord, and just talk with a fellow creative.
Yes, definitely. Yeah, to start, I always like to ask, how did you get into writing? It sounds like you have a science background as a planetarium director. That's so neat, and a physics and astronomy professor. So how did you kind of go into science and then writing as well? Like, have those both been part of your life from a young age?
Yeah, yeah. So let's see. I'll start with writing first. I've always been this kind of person who loves to read. In fact, my parents often joke that I came out of the womb reading a book. In fact, I think in my bag that I take with me everywhere, I have a book in there right now. I've just always loved stories. And then I think at some point when I was in like first or second grade, I remember that I would take these sheets of printer paper from my dad's printer in his office, and I would draw little stick figures and then include words in them, and then I would staple them up together and make stories. And my parents might even still have some of them in the basement. I haven't like gone back and looked in probably 10 years. But and then at some point, oh, when I was probably upper elementary school, um, I was still devouring books, and I remember there wasn't very many books in my reading level because my school did AR or accelerated reading. And so they had all these books categorized in what grade levels they would be appropriate for. But I was at that point way beyond elementary school reading. And I was kind of competitive. And I was just like, well, I got to read what's there. And so I was frustrated that there wasn't a ton of books available for me to read at that library. But I stumbled upon this series called Warriors. It's about feral cats, and it was a ton of fun reading it as a kid. And that ended up sparking me on. Um, and then I also, sometime around fifth grade, I had watched the Transformers movie, and I got an idea inspired by that movie. And that started me off. And then as I've grown older, I experimented with things with role playing games with friends. And then eventually they spun off into their own stories. And now I'm, working on Shroud of Secrets, which is my main work in progress. And then I've gotten some of these short stories published in the past year. So that's my writing journey, just kind of like the Spark Notes version.
Yeah, so Shroud of Secrets. So this is your first novel, sounds like, book that you're
Yeah,
working on. Are you hoping to self-publish, traditionally publish? Are you hoping to write more books and publish after Shroud of Secrets?
I'm open right now. I haven't finished my first draft of Shroud of Secrets. I'm very close to being done with the first draft, or the first draft, because writing Shroud of Secrets has taken several years, and I want to get through the first draft before I even think about like if I'm going to publish it and how I'm going to publish it. But I suppose if readers want a taste of what that world is like, they can read The Fool's Fix, which is the backstory. It involves backstory of two of the major characters of Shroud of Secrets.
Okay. Is this science fiction genre, it sounds like?
Yeah, it's science fiction would probably be the broad category, but I I forget which of my friends coined this, but it's more of a grounded sci-fi because I focus a lot on like relationships between family and like how they interact with each other in the work. And so it's definitely a more unique um, delving into the science fiction genre.
And then, so how does the your current work that you do, like your science work with the planetarium and everything, how does that inform your writing a lot, or did you just you loved writing from a young age, but as you grew older, you
Yeah,
loved science, and that's why
yeah.
you got into that, or what's your story there?
So um, it kind of developed in parallel. I remember when I was in elementary school, there used to be this show on the History Channel called The Universe. I was always so fascinated with that. And then also just like, you know, reading about the dinosaurs, going to the Field Museum in Chicago, because I'm from a town in Indiana near Chicago, and we would always go to the museums up there. And also just like watching all these shows about like ancient Egypt. And it kind of led me to be like, oh, science is really cool. And I was especially most intrigued by astronomy. And I kind of figured out at a young age that I really wanted to do something to do with astronomy. So I would do stuff, extracurriculars like Science Olympiad, and there's this like STEM, like girls mentoring group that I was a part of when I was in middle school. And so that all influenced me to like try to do something in science. And so that's how I ended up studying physics and astronomy at Indiana University. And then at some point, I discovered, because in Chicago, there's a pretty famous planetarium, the Adler Planetarium. It's the oldest planetarium in the Western Hemisphere. And I'd grown up going to that, and I always thought it was really cool. But then I discovered that closer to home, there was the Maryville Community Planetarium. But it was about a 35-minute drive from my parents' house. And so I went and saw that, and I'm like, wow, this is really cool. I got to go behind the scenes. I was like a kid in a candy shop. And I thought that was really cool. And then I got to do an internship there one of the summers when I was a college student. And then um, also parallel to that, which is kind of relevant to my other short story, Spooky Action and Closeness, I got to go on observing trips as a part of class. We would go to a historic observatory on IU's campus called the Kirkwood Observatory. It's named after a famous asteroid astronomer. And so we would practice our skills there with this old 120-year-old telescope. And then during my observational astronomy class, we actually got to go out to Arizona to Kitt Peak National Observatory, which is actually where Spooky Action at a Closeness takes place. And we got to actually use research grade telescopes in order to take images of these tiny, not very massive dwarf galaxies. It is really cool. I took a lot of inspiration from that trip into writing Spooky Action at a Closeness. And then when I went to grad school, I found out that the place that I ended up going had this planetarium. And I was like, that would be really cool to work there. And it turns out I could, as a graduate assistant, that could be one of my duties. And I just really fell in love with working at planetariums there.
I love how you combine, yeah, your love for science and then your faith and then your writing is all together. That's so neat. That
Yeah.
kind of leads into my first question I like to ask guests is how does your faith inspire your approach to your creative work, or do you see your writing as a co-creative effort with Christ, or anything you'd like to share about how your faith informs your writing?
Yeah. Um, I the way I see it with both science and faith, they're both searches for truth, and I'm always like telling my students this because they're both ways of learning things that are facts and are true about the world and how God created the world and how He interacts with it. And um, I always implore myself and my students, you should always be striving to learn more about the world around you and about God. And related to this past December, me and some of my writing friends in this very cool Catholic writing Discord server called Inkwells and Anvils, we actually went through Pope St. John Paul II's letter to artists, and it really highlights how we can use writing as a way to illuminate the truths about the faith, even if like we don't have like characters that like are explicitly Catholic or Christian or anything like that. We can still infuse our stories with the truth that God has written on our hearts.
Love that. I recently read his letter to artists. One of my other writer friends had recommended to me, and it was great. I love to actually see something that was written, especially by a pope that encourages writers in creation. I'm glad that you liked it too. Yeah, do you also see a connection between your writing and creation? Because I know obviously you're very much inspired by creation
Yeah.
since astronomy and you're studying the planets and everything like that. So yeah, I also love creation and love to spend time outside, and I'm inspired by animals and plants, and they usually find their way into my stories. So do you have a similar experience, or how do you see physical creation inspiring your written creation?
I guess a very obvious example for spooky action and closeness is I knew when I was pondering this story for a short story contest, I was like, man, it would be really interesting to have a ghost story take place at an observatory, because I was like, there's plenty of things that could go wrong, and plenty of ways where ghosts can kind of like mess with the living. And so I used my knowledge of observing and how professional astronomers work at observatories in order to craft this story where the protagonist, Josephine, she is kind of trying to avoid some things, and she thought that the best way to avoid what she was avoiding was to just throw herself in her work and just go up to the observatory. She'd have a good night of observing, and then she wouldn't have to think about anything that was bothering her. But knowing the intricacies of like how telescopes work and the computers that control them, I was able to use the ghost in the story to kind of make her confront the things that she was avoiding and come to the realization that she really shouldn't have avoided any of that stuff to begin with.
Yeah, and these are short stories, so
Yeah,
that you've written that you have published in anthologies. Because in your day, is it your day job then? You're a professor? Is that, do you teach like undergraduate
I do.
students?
Yeah, I teach undergraduate students. In the fall, I teach physics, so things like forces and motion, and then I teach an astronomy lab as well. And then in the spring, it's all astronomy. I about stars and galaxies, and I have a lot of fun doing that.
So in your studies with students, do you find that they struggle with science and faith and having those two things go together? Or they really embrace that? Like as they're studying, the universe
Yeah.
and seeing the creator behind the universe? I'd love to hear about that.
Yeah. So I work at a Protestant university, and so a lot of the students that come to us come from some sort of faith background, whether it be the denomination that the university is affiliated with or not. And so I've found that a lot of my students, and in fact, I actually asked this on their first day questionnaire in my astronomy class, and a lot of them were like, yeah, it kind of makes sense that they're not mutually exclusive. And I do get some students who are like, you know, I haven't really thought about this, or I haven't, um, it hasn't been my experience to think of them as not mutually exclusive, but like they're open to thinking about that. And I hope in my classes that I can show them that, yes, these aren't mutually exclusive. And, for many, many years, humanity has often seen that they both allow you to learn about the world. And in fact, many of the great scientists had some sort of faith.
the last person I interviewed, Thomas Salerno, he is writing a book, a
Ooh,
children's book about um, science and I think like study of geology and that sort of thing.
yeah, it's his steno book, correct?
Yes, yes, yeah. And so you're what you were just saying there about yeah,
Yeah,
astronomy
yeah,
really think about that. And yeah, I think that there's this narrative that's commonly written that science and faith are opposed to one another, but actually if you have both, you have the fullness sense of understanding of
yeah.
the world.
The and yeah, Thomas is a great person to have on. I've actually had him on my own podcast, and he just has this beautiful way of looking at the world. And
Mhm.
the way I like to think about it, the analogy that I give is um, people are often familiar with what's called the electromagnetic spectrum, and that's just basically a fancy word for light. And there are different sections of the spectrum that are different kinds of light. So you have the visible light, which is what our eyes see, but you also have infrared, X-ray, radio, microwave, gamma, X-ray, etc. And and this is probably most obvious to an astronomer who does like multi-wavelength studies, but you can even figure it out as just a non-astronomer. But if you image the same object through different kinds of light, you'll see different things. And it's not that those things conflict with each other. Each of those different uh, parts of the spectrum of light reveal different things about it. Um, so much the same, faith and science are kind of like the electromagnetic spectrum, and it allows you to see the world in complementary ways.
Yes. Yeah, I also heard someone said once that, science and faith ask different questions as well.
Mm-hmm.
Like the questions that faith asks, science isn't in a position to answer, and questions that science, answers, faith isn't. So you kind of need both to like have all your questions answered about why are we here? What is our purpose? Why is the world like it is? And how should we treat ourselves and one another, for example. So that's
Yeah.
great. I love that example with the lights. Another question I like to ask guests is, what is your relationship with work and how do you balance like your day job and your writing? And also the church teaches that work is a form of holiness, like our work can sanctify us. Have you seen that in your own life or anything you'd like to share about the
Yeah.
relationship between your work?
Yeah, that's a great question. I know I am currently a work in progress because this is my first full-time big girl job. I've only been in it for a year and a half. And what's been interesting about this is working full-time has revealed a lot of ways where I have tried to just like push through on my own merits when the work has, revealed ways that I can grow in areas that I have weaknesses. Like a good example of this is I do like to plan things, but sometimes just like sitting down and just planning out my week. And it's in part because being newer to my job, I don't have a good handle on how long certain tasks are going to take me. And there's a lot of prep that goes into being a professor and teaching students. And so I've realized that I'm not quite as good at that as I thought I was. And so I'm having to learn how to balance all of that. And another good example is I've always been that kind of person who I don't like to leave things unfinished, and I find it very hard to disengage right in the middle of something. And so that is another area that um, having a job has forced me to realize something that I used to be able to just like push through and ignore. And so I'm always just kind of learning how to do that because rest is good and work is good and leisure is good, but you have to find the right balance of that. And you can't lean too far one way or too far the other way, or else you're just not going to live the fulfilled life that God calls you to.
That's very true. Yeah, and that balance can be so hard to strike sometimes. But yes, like there is a place for work, and then there is also a place for rest, and we
Yeah.
need to have both to be
Yeah.
at our best potentials and our best selves. That's
Yeah. Yeah. And honestly, just it's funny because my writer friends on Inkles and Anvils, I'm very well known for not having the most normal sleep habits because I, like an astronomer, tend to go to bed super, super late. It's kind of like Anna in the opening scenes of Frozen, where she comes into Elsa's room and she's like, Elsa, the sky is awake, so I'm awake and it's time to play. And I'm like, that's me. But I have to temper that a little bit. And hilariously enough, the moderator of our server, she created, we have this sleep command that we will type into the chat box in order to encourage people to go to sleep.
Because you're up studying the stars, right? And the planets and
Yeah,
everything else in the sky. That's great. Well, I'd love to hear more about anything you want to share about your writing. So how long, so you're new, you're kind of brand new to your job at the university, and how long have you been writing like professionally? You've got your two short stories out, you have Shroud of Secrets in the works. Are you hoping to really get like write more or more often or more works, or is this like just when you have an idea you like to write something or
definitely when I have an idea, I like to write something. I know, because the two short stories that you've mentioned, they were both published last year, one in March, one in November. And those were stories that really I had ideas for, because when I don't have ideas, it's hard to make myself actually sit down and write. And there were also one or two other short story contests I'd heard about, but I didn't quite have the idea that I felt confident in executing. And so when it came time for the Christmas Ghost Story contest, I actually had an idea to work with. And I'm like, I think I can write something based off that. And then I brainstormed it with a friend and I'm like, yes, we're gonna participate. And then The Fool's Fix, how that came about is way back in my senior year of college, I had taken a creative writing class. And around that time, I was trying to explain how in Shroud of Secrets, her husband, how they met. And I was like, it would be really funny if it were, in a way, a comedy of errors on her now husband's part, that kind of like brought them together, and just to explore the humor of the situation of her now husband realizing that he did not make a good first impression on her. And so I had to write a short story for that creative writing class. And the first draft of what became The Fool's Fix was uh, what I wrote for that story, for that assignment.
that's so cool that you write short stories and you've had a few that are published because I
Yeah,
also like to write short stories, but I really struggle with the shorter, like page count that you have to work with short stories. So I have a
yeah,
few that I've written and I've queried a few with various journals. None have been picked up yet, but that's one of my goals is I want to get a short story published somewhere. So far, I've really been just writing novel length books, but that's
yeah.
great. Yeah. So, last question I like to ask, which is kind of a fun one. Is there a particular Bible verse, prayer, song, or person who inspires you as a creative? You can
Oh,
pick one
yes.
to share on.
Well, the Bible verse and prayer, I had something immediately in mind. I'm looking up the Bible verse because it's a screensaver on my phone, but my phone cycles through three pictures for my like screensaver. So my favorite Bible verse, and it inspires kind of my like vibe of being a lifelong learner, and it's also what inspired the name of my podcast. And it's just a great quote from the Bible. It's Daniel chapter 12, verse 3, and it says, "But those with insight shall shine brightly like the splendor of the firmament, and those who lead the many to justice shall be like the stars forever." And it it just ties up like the star vibes with my love of being a lifelong learner and just how important that is to the core of the human being. And I first heard of it from one of my best friends for either Christmas or my birthday. She's very talented both graphic design and stuff, and she made me a screensaver for my birthday with this quote with like a starry like galaxy background, and I just have been in love with that ever since. And then the prayer, which is kind of along similar themes, but I believe it's attributed to St. Thomas Aquinas, and I learned it in grad school. But it says, "Grant, O merciful God, that I may ardently desire, prudently examine, truthfully acknowledge, and perfectly accomplish what is pleasing to thee for the praise and glory of thy name. Amen." And I just love how it inspires people to want to do their best in, growing their relationship with God and learning about the world that God has created.
I've been recently listening to a podcast called Catholic Classics, and
Hmm.
two hosts are priests, and they always, I don't, they either start or end with that. And I never knew who it was attributed to, but it's Thomas Aquinas, so that's great. Yeah, they read and explore different
Yeah,
classic
I think
literature.
I've heard of that before, and it's a great podcast. I need to listen to it.
Right now, I've been listening to them talk about Introduction to the Devout Life from St.
Oh,
Francis de Sales, and then
I've heard
their
good
next,
things.
yeah, and the next is going to be, I think, St. Augustine's Confessions, and then just,
Amazing.
yep, and then just this past fall they did, I think, Story of a Soul by Therese of Lisieux. So
Ooh, yeah.
yes, yes,
See, all of those are great, and I've read Confessions, but I haven't done any of the other ones. But hilariously enough, I was doing an interview on Thursday night for my podcast, and my uh, my guest, he mentioned Introduction to the Devout Life, and I'd always been like, well, St. Francis de Sales, he's a doctor of the church. His writing is probably not very um, approachable or digestible. And he's like, no, hold up, it really is. You need to read it. And I'm like, man, maybe I might need to read that finally this year.
all right, for those of you who are listening, if you'd like to stay connected with Madeline, you can look at the show notes where I have links to her professional email, Instagram and Twitter, podcast Instagram, and podcast website. I'm definitely going to have to check out your podcast. That's so cool
Yeah.
that you interview fellow Christians in the STEM fields. I'm sure that you have some really fascinating conversations over there.
Oh, yeah. And as of this recording, next week, I'm dropping an interview with a priest of my home diocese, the Diocese of Gary, who he's a baby priest and he's also an Air Force chaplain, and he just has an incredible story. And I got to learn a lot about what it means to be an Air Force chaplain because I honestly had no idea, and he's just such a pleasure to talk with. So it was a fun interview, and I recommend it to everyone.
Yeah, I'll have to check that out for sure. That's great. I like to close each episode with a closing prayer that can be found on Catholic Creative's website. It's a really good one to inspire and motivate the work of Christian creatives. So we can start in the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Creator of the universe, how infinite and astonishing are your worlds. O divine imagination, you created a creator when you imagined me into existence. Breathe breath into so much dust. Let me lament for forgetting daily to rise up out of the clay. Free me from the deceit of the mundane and from the lure of comfort, which dulls all my given edges. Most of all, light of my life, forgive my blindness, open all my eyes, salt me with newness and dreams. Fire my soul with your inventive flame. Let me be committed to the world by it and find in it the deepest joy.